In 1965, the arrival of 50,000 U.S. troops in Vietnam marked the beginning of one of the most controversial and transformative strategies in modern warfare. Faced with having to fight a counterinsurgency war for the very first time and in a dense jungle with near-perfect conditions for the Viet Cong to launch ambushes, did the U.S. military might ever have a chance? In today's video, we'll dive into the critical years from 1965 to 1967, when America's military launched its formidable search and destroy missions against Viet Cong guerrillas. What tactics were used, and what challenges were encountered? In the summer of 1965, the U.S. escalated its participation in the Vietnam War by deploying tens of thousands of troops under the Military Assistance Command Vietnam, or MACV. This significant increase in forces was part of a broader American strategy to strengthen South Vietnam against the North Vietnamese aid of the Viet Cong rebellion, augmented by North Vietnamese regulars, some 8,000 men in all. The hope was that a combination of American soldiers and overwhelming air power would force North Vietnam to give up its ambitions in the South. The U.S. strategy emphasized gradual engagement, primarily from the air, having already started secretly bombing supply lines in neighboring Laos in late 1964. By 1965, they expanded these bombings to North Vietnam itself as part of Operation Rolling Thunder. However, these attacks carefully avoided hitting major cities like Hanoi, focusing instead on secondary targets. The goal was not to conquer territory, but to pressure North Vietnam into negotiating a peace favorable to South Vietnam. Lyndon B. Johnson, the president, and his advisors were cautious. They wanted to avoid any actions that might draw in the Chinese, as had happened in the Korean War. This limited the ground operations to South Vietnam, despite the known routes supplying the Viet Cong through Laos and Cambodia. As a result, the approach was to incrementally increase the military pressure while hoping for a political solution. Yet with each step, the complexity of the conflict deepened. As the U.S. pushed forward with its military strategy in Vietnam, it quickly encountered several demoralizing challenges. The dense jungles and unpredictable swamps of Vietnam proved to be hostile environments for American troops, who were trained and equipped for more conventional warfare. The Viet Cong guerrillas, familiar with the territory, used it to their advantage, employing hit-and-run tactics that made them elusive targets. The U.S. military's reliance on air power also faced limitations. While airstrikes and artillery could devastate large areas, they were less effective against guerrillas, who could blend back into the civilian population or hide in the complicated maze of tunnels they had built across the countryside. This inability to decisively engage the enemy led to an exhausting slog, where U.S. forces suffered high casualties without clear victories. Politically, the situation was equally complex. The U.S. strategy was constrained by a need to avoid widening the war, which could trigger involvement from China or the Soviet Union. President Johnson ruled out a full-scale invasion of North Vietnam for fear of repeating the scenario of the Korean War, where Chinese forces had intervened on behalf of North Korea. The decision meant that U.S. ground operations were almost entirely confined to South Vietnam, limiting their tactical options and efficacy. Moreover, there was a gradual realization that the war could not be won quickly or decisively through military might alone. The North Vietnamese leadership remained steadfast, refusing to negotiate as long as foreign troops were on South Vietnamese soil. This steadfastness, combined with the Viet Cong's complex guerrilla tactics, meant that the U.S. found itself in a protracted conflict with no easy resolution in sight, challenging the initial expectations of a swift and decisive victory. As this early phase of the Vietnam War progressed, U.S. military tactics evolved in response to the unique challenges posed by guerrilla warfare and the difficult terrain. Recognizing the limitations of conventional combat, the U.S. shifted towards a strategy centered on search and destroy. This approach aimed to use the mobility and superior firepower of U.S. forces to locate and engage Viet Cong units, inflict heavy casualties using airstrikes and artillery, and withdraw without holding territory. Platoons would head out from fortified positions, hiking out into dense jungle, going village by village to identify and destroy the enemy. On identifying a potential enemy location, they would clear out the village from civilians and call in the airstrikes that would bomb the location. Another version of this was the Zippo missions, so named after the Zippo lighters used to torch the village believed to be aligned with the Viet Cong. the U.S. military introduced several new tools and weapon systems to facilitate these tactics. A significant change was adopting the M16 rifle, replacing the heavier M14. The M16 was lighter and more suited to close-quarter jungle combat, where engagements were typically at shorter ranges. Alongside the M16, the U.S. troops were equipped with the M60 machine gun and M79 grenade launcher, enhancing their firepower in combat situations. One of the most significant adjustments was the increased use of helicopters, transforming mobility for U.S. forces in Vietnam. The UH-1 Iroquois, commonly known as the Huey, became a symbol of U.S. military presence in Vietnam. It was used for rapid insertion and extraction of troops, medical evacuations, and close air support. The mobility provided by helicopters allowed U.S. forces to conduct operations across the challenging terrain more effectively and react quickly to intelligence about Viet Cong positions. However, these tactical adjustments also required significant changes in operational thinking. The heavy reliance on air support and mechanized units meant that the U.S. forces often lacked the subtle touch required for counterinsurgency, which involves defeating the enemy military and winning the hearts and minds of the civilian population. This oversight often led to increased isolation of the local Vietnamese people, who suffered from the heavy-handed tactics and collateral damage caused by American operations. What started as a war of attrition, the U.S. underestimated the Viet Cong's ability to match its forces. Whenever large numbers of Viet Cong troops were captured or killed, they were quickly replaced. Whenever the Viet Cong were pushed out of certain territories, once the U.S. left the area, they would simply return with more reinforcements. The war demonstrated that superior technology and conventional military strength could not easily overcome a determined insurgent force operating within a supportive or coerced civilian population. The Vietnam War exacted a profound toll on both U.S. and Viet Cong forces, impacting them in deeply different but significant ways. American troops, unaccustomed to guerrilla warfare and the challenging terrain of Vietnam, found themselves frequently ambushed, unable to utilize their superior technology effectively against an elusive enemy. This led to high casualty rates and psychological strain on the average U.S. soldier. The Viet Cong, while less equipped, leveraged their knowledge of the local environment and help from local civilians to sustain their operations. Even though they endured heavy bombardments and significant losses, their adaptive tactics and the simplicity of their logistical needs allowed them to maintain resilience and effectiveness over time. One of the other more challenging aspects of the war was in assessing operational progress and military effectiveness. Unlike in World War II, where the tangible measures of effectiveness were centered around the amount of ground gained or lost, there was no such measurement for the counterinsurgency nature of the Vietnam War. Any ground gained during the search and destroy campaigns was quickly regained by the Viet Cong once U.S. troops retreated. Additionally, as there was such strong opposition at home for yet another long and protracted ground war, there was intense political pressure from the public for transparency on progress and, ultimately, illustrating when the war would end. This led to an attitude of, if you can't count what's important, you make what you can count important. The U.S. Department of Defense adopted a method from the business world known as statistical management, revolving around quantifying every possible element of the war effort, counting everything from the number of bombs deployed to meals consumed. Central to this strategy was the body count measure, the total number of enemy combatants the U.S. claimed to have killed. The idea was simple. The more enemy killed, the closer to total annihilation of the enemy and closer to victory. However, hindsight has proven that this approach was not effective and led to a shift in ground activity from protect and defend to one of kill anything that moves. Commanders reported these figures up the chain of command, where higher numbers were often equated with success. But here's where things started to go wrong. The reliance on counting corpses led to a major issue. Since there was no simple way to differentiate enemy corpses from civilian corpses, commanders, under pressure to show results, frequently inflated casualty figures, which led to the famous, if it moves, it is the enemy. Therefore, kill it. By focusing on numbers more than understanding the situation, important details like soldier morale, the changing support from local people, and the Viet Cong's ability to recover were overlooked. This limited perspective failed to see the full complexity of the fight, making the conflict last longer and cost more. The body count measure of effectiveness adopted during the Vietnam War as a metric for success had profound and detrimental impacts on the conduct and outcome of the conflict. By fixating on the number of enemy casualties, U.S. commanders and policymakers neglected the broader strategic objectives of counterinsurgency warfare, which required winning the hearts and minds of the local population and establishing a stable government. This singular focus led to a disregard for civilian lives, as U.S. forces prioritized maximizing enemy fatalities without adequately distinguishing between combatants and non-combatants, resulting in widespread collateral damage and alienation of the Vietnamese populace. Additionally, as body count mattered most, pacification during missions was not pushed. Moreover, this approach demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of guerrilla warfare, which was deeply intertwined with the civilian population and necessitated a more nuanced and patient approach. As a result, the reliance on quantitative metrics like the body count obscured more meaningful measures of progress, such as territorial control, and the sentiments of the local population, ultimately prolonging the conflict and undermining the achievements of U.S. war objectives. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.